My name is Carol Bond, and I'm your MC for today. We would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Indigenous Australians present today. Welcome to our hybrid meeting, to those online and those in the room. Thanks today will be given by Ruth Carlos Martinez, followed by the Royal Toast presented by President Adrian. Please ensure your glass is charged.
I am prepared. I just didn't have a wig on when I was introduced. Okay, well, good afternoon, Rotarians and guests, both online and present today. And what a beautiful day. The theme for Rotary International this February is peace and conflict resolution. And what a worthy purpose this is in the very troubled world we live in today. Rotary's commitment to carrying out service projects and supporting peace fellowships and scholarships continues to see our members take action to address the underlying causes of conflict, including poverty, discrimination, ethnic tension, and lack of access to education. Rotary International is deeply concerned with the ongoing loss of life and humanitarian hardship caused by the ongoing war in Ukraine, and marshalling networks and fundraising to take meaningful action in the region. Our club has a continuing commitment in this area of service, and in particular we should acknowledge and give thanks to Bob Fells for his extraordinary contribution and success over many years, facilitating Rotary Peace programs and the selection of postgraduate global scholars and peace fellows, which resulted in him receiving Rotary Foundation awards in 2014 and 2021. It's good to see Bob here today looking so fit. At last week's meeting, President Adrian highlighted the work of Rob McGuirk in his leadership of the Rotary Peace Park Peace Bells project. And many of you will have read in this week's bulletin about the 4 peace bells to be unveiled at the Rotary Convention in May, and the 4 steps every person can take for peace building in Australia and internationally. We can be proud as Rotarians of our ongoing involvement to try and make the world a more peaceful place. Thank you. Over to you, President.
Thank you, Peter. Rotarians and guests, a toast to Australia and Rotary International. Australia, Rotary International. Thank you, and please be seated. We'll now be breaking for lunch and we'll reconvene around 1:10. And for those of you online, please take up the offer of the Zoom breakout rooms, which will be open shortly. Thank you. Now, we have visiting Rotarians, visitors and guests of members, both online and in person today. And for those of you in the room, could you please stand when I announce your name and remain standing for our club to welcome you in our traditional manner. But first of all, I'd like to welcome an international visiting Rotarian who's joining us online today. She's a board member of Conciliation Resources, which is Kieran's organisation, and that's Nesta Hatendi, who is joining us from Zimbabwe, where it is approximately, from what I can figure out, it's probably about 4:15 in the morning currently. So Nesta, welcome to our meeting. We have other international visiting Rotarians here in person with us today. We have Rebecca Elder from the Rotary Club of Cedro Woolley in Washington State, USA. And we also have James and Judy Elliott, who are from the Rotary Club of Columbia, Missouri in the USA as well. And I see that we have a banner from Columbia. And Judy, if you'd like to come up on stage with James as well now. But please remain standing. We also have Steve DeBono, who's a guest of Robert Fisher, who will be our new corporate designee from Morgan Stanley. And we also have, standing at the back with the camera, once again, we have Andre Martinovici, guest of Ramona. Could you please give them all a very warm welcome? You may be seated. Now, annually, our club, through its Rotary Foundation Committee, nominates a candidate to the district for a Rotary International Postgraduate Scholarship. I'd like to call Carol Bond, our International Service Director, to the podium to tell us more.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Adrian. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. I'm here to speak with you about 3 opportunities today. The first 2 are related to the theme for this month. And you will see on your tables a 2-sided flyer, right? Sorry, I didn't put my thing in front of the camera. The first opportunity is to nominate somebody who could be a potential Rotary Global Scholar. So our club has had a Global Scholar almost every year for the last, since I think 2012. And Rotary District 9800 has designated a targeted postgraduate scholarship to focus on overseas study for a master's degree to a value of up to US $60,000 or 2 scholarships at US $30,000 each. The person needs to be a resident of Victoria, and they need to be accepted into a postgraduate program that starts in September, which means the Northern Hemisphere. In the past, people have gone to Japan, the United States, or the UK to take advantage of these scholarships. If you know somebody who is heading overseas to study and could use a top-up to help them afford the costs of living while they're abroad, this is an excellent opportunity for them. The applications close on the 31st of March, and if you would be happy to talk to either me or Bob Fells, either of us would be happy to work with your nominee to help them with their application and guide and coach them through the process to hopefully what will be a very successful outcome. The other opportunity, staying within the theme, is the Rotary Peace Scholarships. There are 90 global fellowships now available for fully funded university training in peace building and conflict resolution. All Rotary Peace Fellows are selected through a competitive worldwide process, and the applications close on the 15th of May. Now these are for master's degree programs, and for people who are wanting to become leaders and catalysts for peace and conflict resolution around the world, people who want to work in NGOs, the military, law enforcement, peace education, media, international organizations such as the Red Cross, the UN, and the World Bank. Having gone through the Peace Scholarship Program myself, I can say that this is a wonderful opportunity, and it is really motivated young people who really put service above self. This is an ideal degree program, and we'd be happy, again, Bob and I would be happy to encourage people to apply and successfully be admitted to these programs. The final opportunity, which is not in a flyer on your table, but is something that the Environmental Sustainability Committee is working on, is our Environment Award. We've had 2 awards in the past couple of years, and we're looking now for young people, well, not necessarily young people, but people who are at a stage in their journey of service, who are making a difference in the environment and sustainability. You might remember Claire Moore from Sweet Justice, who has an ongoing relationship with the club through Quinn Scalzo and Jim Orchard and others. And we're looking for people for whom this award would make a difference in their journey towards making our world a more environmentally sustainable place. So you could talk to me about that, or Peter Berg or Gary Fowler, and we'd be happy for those nominations by the end of March. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Well, tomorrow we'll be sending out to all our members information about upcoming events at the Rotary International Convention in May, which, as I said earlier, is only 13 weeks away. So the events include club events, convention events, and a district gala thank you dinner following the convention. Now, I'd like to point out that our club's signature event for this year, our marvellous Melbourne cocktail party at the Hotel Windsor on the Sunday night of the convention. If there's one event you attend as a club member this year, this is the one. You'll meet members of our sister clubs from around the world, our friendship clubs, the clubs founded by James Wheeler Davidson, our JWD clubs, the first clubs of each country, and the Australian capital city clubs, all joining us for a special night at the Hotel Windsor. Bookings open tomorrow, and please invite partners, friends, and guests. You've also heard a bit about the peace bells lately. The team led by Rob McGirt continues to do a mountain of work, and we're still on track. I'm delighted to advise members that past President Mary Barry, who's also chair of the host organising committee, will be leading the presentation of the bells on stage at the opening ceremony at the convention. So well done, Mary. As you're aware, there's still some fundraising to be done, and in the next week, you'll also all receive further information about our fundraising campaign. So please, in the meantime, feel free to reach out to Joe in the Melbourne Rotary office if you're able to make a donation. And with that, I'll now draw the raffle. So today we've got a lovely bottle of Pinot Noir from Kumu Village in New Zealand, and the winner is an orange ticket. It's E26. And it's Deb. Congratulations, Deb. And it's now my pleasure to hand this meeting over to our Chair of the Day, past President Robert Fisher, to further introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, President Adrian. Did you know we are registered as one of just 8 peace builder clubs in Australia? Well, as you've heard already, February is our Peace and Conflict Resolution Month, when we shine a light on one of Rotary's 7 areas of focus, namely peace building and conflict prevention. So it's extremely important for us and appropriate for us to have such a distinguished speaker as Kieran O'Toole to speak on the topic climate change and conflict risks. Conciliation Resources is an international organization committed to stopping violent conflict and creating more peaceful solutions. And Kieran is a member of their executive management team. He heads up the Southeast Asia and Pacific program, covering their work in the Philippines, PNG, and indeed right across the Pacific region. Kieran commenced working for Conciliation Resources in 2010, when he headed up the organization's efforts to support the 2012 Fiji Constitution development process. Prior to joining Conciliation Resources, Kieran worked in the private sector in senior people and program management positions in the Middle East and Australia. He holds a master's in international development and various other topics I was hearing earlier from RMIT University. Members and guests, it gives me great pleasure to give you Kieran O'Toole.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you all for the invite. It's a real pleasure to come here today to talk about our work. I just hope, I was just explaining before that there's quite a lot of jargon in our work, as all of you have jargon in your work. So I don't know if there's a jargon sign, but if you want me to slow down, if you want me to hold on, what are you talking about, please feel free to do so. The focus of the conversation, or what I'm going to talk about, is climate change and conflict. And the focus of what I'm going to talk about is, is on climate change and conflict risks. And I'm really specifically going to look at the Pacific region, more specifically Melanesia and what you would know as Melanesia, so sort of from Fiji through to Papua New Guinea or West Papua. What I'll do to start with is just explain who we are, Conciliation Resources, and also explain what an international peacebuilding NGO like ourselves does. So to picture what we do, it's quite broad and it's applied differently in every different context. So I broke it down into 3 parts, and the first one, working with peacebuilding partners, is probably the core of our work. It is most of our work. It's 70% of our work. But of course, it changes with each context and the needs of each context. And that is really supporting and working with individuals, organizations, governments, but mostly civil society organizations in contexts affected by conflict, and primarily working at a community level. So supporting communities to be able to manage conflict, to analyze conflict. It's really core to enabling societies to move forward, in particular after conflict. Other work we do very quickly is more the direct type of work that we do. This is us directly working on key drivers of conflict, and it varies a lot. And what we're sort of known pretty well for is what we call comparative learning, these sort of learnings that we bring to context. And then the final one, mediation support, is more a reference to peace processes, so peace negotiations that you may be familiar with. And a lot of the time what we get involved is behind the scenes, sort of enabling both sides to think through options, back channeling, this, I think what was mentioned before, involvement in even constitution development, so providing options for the way forward. So you can see the work that we do is very diverse, and it includes a lot of analysis, a lot of work at community right up to political level. And if later on I can give examples of specific contexts where we work right through those levels. So honing in on what I'm talking about today, so forget about all of that. What I'm going to talk about is focusing on the conflict risks from climate change in the Pacific region. Stepping back a little bit, it's sensible for me to just have a little discussion around land and resources in the Pacific. Some of you may be familiar with how it works in the Pacific, but it is sizably different to Australia or most other industrialized parts of the world. Land and resources are communally owned. They're typically owned by small groups, villages, communities, and it's land and resources are communally owned, so owned by everybody. But some of the problems with that, or some of the issues, is there's not necessarily clear boundaries, not necessarily clear who has access to what resources, and these things are negotiated, and tension between communities is really the standard practice in sorting out who has access to what in the Pacific region, in a sense. Now that's a broad general statement, is different in different countries. Like Fiji is much more structured. Vanuatu has a level of structure, but in particular, societies that have been affected by conflict, Solomon Islands and parts of Papua New Guinea, you find that there is this lack of clarity on boundaries, and layered on top of that, lack of clarity at times on governance. Like, what is the authority within these communities? You have chiefs and headmen, and sometimes it can be, from an outsider point of view, very hard to work out who actually makes decisions, how decisions are made. Good example, Bougainville, post-conflict and conflict-affected context. It's a matrilineal society. So land and resources are actually handed down through the female line within the community, but decisions are made by groups of men or individuals. So it's really complex. Within all of those societies, and this is something also to say, what I'm going to talk about today is like it's doom, right? These are the risks, but that's what I'm talking about. Reality is, within the Pacific, within all of these communities, there is a level of resilience. There is conflict resolution mechanisms. They exist for hundreds of years and have been developed for hundreds of years within all of these communities. And they tend to be quite different from one community to another, in particular one region to another. They're traditional, they're typically gift-giving, but also land and resources becomes the sort of device of negotiation between different communities and within communities. So think of those conflict resolution mechanisms, the governance mechanisms, unclear, structured, but also get weakened through violent conflict. So if you think of the damage that can be caused through violent conflict, Bougainville, Solomon Islands, highlands of Papua New Guinea, it weakens these bonds within communities. And not all, I'm making broad general sweeping statements. So just the very first risk, I think I have 4 of them, 4 slides to go through. Think of even land use and access to land. Climate change will degrade, reduce the land available within the Pacific over time. And this is likely to accelerate in time. So this will be quite like through salinity of land, through coastal erosion, there will be less land available. So the tensions that exist within and between communities are likely to rise. Question marks over whether some of the governance and conflict resolution mechanisms that exist within these communities will be able to adapt, will be able to deal with and manage the changes in land access to land and land usage. The second and very important one is around displacement and relocation. So again, describing reduction in land, the availability of land and resources, and the effects that this has on communities. Bringing in also natural disasters, so an increased number of weather events, as we call them, but cyclones, and the intensity and frequency of cyclones. You will have a lot more, or likely to have a lot more, displacement and relocation. You can roughly break down the types of displacement and relocation. Some of it will be quite structured, will be governments, and it's already happening, where governments are moving communities from to other pieces of land, to what seem available pieces of land. And these are government bureaucratic type processes. There tends to be limited consultation with communities when these happen, or the communities are just not familiar with bureaucratic systems. They don't quite know what they're agreeing to. And this can lead to conflict between the community, the recipient communities, and the new communities. And then, of course, the conflict resolution mechanisms, hundreds of years old, can be quite different between the communities. The other evidence, or what we're seeing, which sounds great and is great, where communities accept communities. So these are agreements between community leaders. So community leaders saying, okay, my neighboring community, come join us. But a lot of the time, these decision-making are made between headmen, 2 men making a decision, not necessarily with the level of consultation that you'd want within your own community. So tensions rise within the recipient community, and likewise with the community that moves in. And there's examples of these now happening in the Pacific. And these are some of the types of communities that our partners are working in, building their capacities to be able to manage the complex issues that arise. The third, and probably the most important type of dislocation will be, and has been happening, is what you might call unstructured or informal movement. So that's in particular people, families, young people in particular, moving into informal settlements in urban centres. So Honiara, Fiji, PNG. And these, think again of the governance and conflict resolution mechanisms. These are families, not communities. These are individuals that are moving away from what were the authority in their lives, within their communities, to a place where that authority doesn't really exist, with conflict resolution mechanisms that are different or don't exist within these informal settlements. And that leads to this, and then also arriving in where there's limited resources, underemployment, serious issues around employment, especially for young men in these informal settlements. Again, creating a sort of a reservoir of fragility, in a sense, in the urban centres. And you can see that very strongly in places like Honiara, with recent riots a few months ago, and also you can see it in Port Moresby, to a lesser degree in Suva. This one I think is self-explanatory, but just to hone into it, this is more of the temporary effects but yet times devastating effects that natural disasters, really talking about cyclones, the intensity of these increasing. Already you're seeing it in the Pacific, and the effects of them they have. Again, I'm coming back to that governance, conflict resolution mechanisms, where you're dealing with sort of temporary tensions, like really serious tensions around losing your house, your property, destruction of property, and the effects this can have on what are the conflict resolution and the conflict and the peace building or the peace maintenance mechanisms within communities. Of course, again, there's a bit of jargon here. With some of them, please, in questions, ask me any more details if it doesn't make sense as well. This one, perhaps we can relate to a bit more. This is around increased authoritarianism, sort of crisis management and the effects that has on state governance. I'm more talking about state governance now. So if you think of a natural disaster, the immediate reaction of the populace is when we want quick decisions, we want firm and quick decisions, and we want firm governance. Think of what happened in Victoria around COVID. The devices are states of emergency, which are the standard and legitimate devices to be able to deal with natural disasters. But what we're dealing with in the Pacific in particular, but also in the Philippines, where we work also, is relatively new state structures and relatively new state institutions and a relatively new political culture around democracy and inclusion. I would use more inclusion and inclusion in decision making. We're only talking about decades old. They're also, these states are dealing with really diverse communities, geographically diverse, ethnically diverse communities. And what we're likely to see through this sort of crisis management and crisis governance, so where you've got continuous cyclones and continuous natural disasters, continuous dislocation, we're likely to see an increase in authoritarian culture of governance. So we would call it exclusive governance, so you're limited influence on decision making, limited influence of gender influence, limited influence of minority groups being like geographically isolated, ethnic minority groups. In turn, the state can become a driver of violent conflict. The state begins to fear the other. You can have it, the state controlled by one group, in a sense, and reacting to challenge from other groups. So you may find secessionist movements starting to grow in reaction to an authoritarian style of government. These are a little bit theory at this stage, but you can see even from the Victorian example, not to say that the Victorian government turned into an authoritarian government, but Australia has 100 years, if not hundreds of years, of experience of inclusive governance that it can slide back into. Not necessarily the case in a lot of the places we work. So I'm coming to an end. What do we do about it? I suppose what we talk about is a number of areas that I feel the Australian government, other donors, we should be focused on, is supporting sort of like a community up approach. So I described governance, conflict resolution mechanisms, this sort of supporting those mechanisms to be able to adapt. And that's in a lot of ways what our partners do, to be able to adapt, to be able to function better. I mean, this is just a little graph of the type of thing we do, where we support communities to really map out governance in their own communities and what are the gaps. So that's sort of like, to us, that's the starting point. The other thing as well is this type of thinking needs to also be included in how other development and humanitarian INGOs work. So if you think of, at the moment, there's quite a lot of climate change mitigation, building sea walls, etc. What happens quite often is because of this feeling of a crisis and we need to do it fast, it can actually cause problems and impinge on the governance of those communities, okay? And create competition between communities, who is a seawall and not. So it can actually fuel some of the tensions between and within communities. So this is about, what we always advocate is doing really deep conflict analysis before you even step into a community and work in a community. The other thing, which is more programming, more to do with my world, is you need to be adaptive in what you do, and we would say the same to others. You can't, there's no one size fits all, every community is different. Climate change will affect communities in different ways, will affect urban centres different to rural. So we need to be, and this will change. So there's no what we call linear approach to this. You do this and then you do this and you take an example from elsewhere. You need to do the constant analysis and change as needed. And then the other part of it, and this relates mostly to the national government, what I described as the crisis management form of government, is supporting civil society and media. Within the Pacific, there's a growing civil society, pursuing human rights, pursuing governance issues within their countries, is supporting them, and also media. If you think of some of the greatest tools to avoid, I would say, more than a challenge, authoritarian forms of governance, is that type of questioning, is that type of, I suppose, culture of accountability, transparency, accountability. Yeah, I just wanted just one more slide to say, we are Conciliation Resources, but in actual fact, these are the groups that actually do the work, in a sense. And sometimes I think, here I am, nice restaurant, giving this talk, but these are the people in Fiji, in particular, these are all the partners in Fiji, that work within the communities, do the hard work. And these are the groups that we support and work with. So, I mean, if you get a chance to look them up, Transcend Oceania, the Pacific Centre for Peace Building, and the Toda Peace Institute is actually more of a global organization that focuses on this area. And I think that's it. Thank you. That's my detail about my email address. Jump on that website. I'm sure Nesta would also recommend to look at our website. Check us out. There's a lot of good resources on the peace building field. I think the other thing that Conciliation Resources does quite well is tries to take learnings from peace building and peace processes and share them among their field, but also more broadly. And we're always looking for funding. If you know somebody, if you have deep pockets or know people with deep pockets, send them my direction.
Thank you very much, Kieran. I think we've got loads of time for questions. I hope there are lots of them out there, hands going up everywhere. Please wait for the microphone and give Kieran your name before you ask your question. Sue.
Sue McCarthy. Thank you. That was very interesting, with all those layers of complexity. But being an old banker, I'd like to know who funds you. Where does the money come from?
We're funded primarily by governments, so we get some funding from the Australian government. So the program that I run has about 15 different donors, like everything, like German government, EU, Sweden, Australian government. The work that we do on climate change is primarily MFAT, which is the New Zealand government. We have a loose policy. It depends on where we're working. So if we're working in particular in a sensitive political environment, so Bougainville is the best example. So in Bougainville, we don't have any Australian funding, partially because there is the perceptions of them. We have had Australian funding, but the perceptions of Australia within that environment, that because we have to play or always attempt to be perceived as impartial. We can't do our job unless we're perceived as that. So what we tend to have is, so in Bougainville, we have 3 different donors. So we would, so in other words, there's not the perception that we're beholden to any government, that we have a number of donors. So that's what we tend to do. But really, funding primarily comes from governments. We also, as an organization, get funding from foundations, individuals. I mean, if you jump on our website, you'll see there's a donate section. As I say, be correct. Well, that's the type of funding in a lot of ways we really want, is that type of core funding, which can be very difficult for us to get. I think there was another.
Bruce Davidson. Terrific presentation. You've covered a lot of ground. It's a very complex problem. So complex that I'm just a little bit overwhelmed, to tell you the truth. And I wondered what you might say if we tried to achieve something in correcting things there, maybe in one place, what Australia could do, it was one initiative to do something that would improve things.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the solutions to these problems are long-term. You know, there's no real immediate solution. Like, there's not like an instant investment necessarily. I think what Australia, stepping back a bit, I think over the last years, what we've seen, for example, there was a conflict and fragility team within DFAT in Australia, in Canberra. And this is the team we related to. You know, we could talk the same language. I know you experienced some of my jargon there, conflict mechanisms, etc. But they understood what we talked about. And when we talked about long-term solutions, investing in peace-building actors who are working in communities, investment in analysis in this area, that team has been folded. They're one of the only countries in the G20 even that doesn't have a conflict-focused part of its foreign affairs. So the one thing Australia could do is the very starting point, immediate, which is maybe part of what you're asking, is to reform a team like that. We struggle to engage with the Australian government in the conversation around these things because they don't necessarily have the language. And it's been a long process of change within DFAT, we've noticed. And even the funding, as I said, we have very little funding from Australia. We have an office here. We have made a commitment to setting up in Australia, register in Australia. We have staff in Australia. We get very little funding from Australia. It's just a very hard sell. So I suppose it's to shift parallel. Security is important, you know, natural disasters, it does need intervention, it needs security, and it needs to build up, you know, security, policing, etc. in these states. But parallel to that, there's a need to understand and support peace-building work. In particular, actors in these individuals, governments that are working on these issues.
Hi, Kieran. Rob McGuirk. Thanks for your talk. During the mid-2000s, I worked with the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the sort of things that you're doing seem to me similar to what they're doing. But I notice in our region, we don't have such an organisation, but we do have the Pacific Island Forum. Are you working with them or ASEAN in terms of a government-based organisation through the regions?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say we work directly with the forum. I think there's a lot of, so you've got, like, for example, the UNDP, you've got the PIFS, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, you've got the Melanesian Spearhead Group. So I suppose we do our own work. There's a lot of what I would call sort of more coordination and sharing, you know. So what are you doing? Okay, well, we're doing this, making sure that we're not duplicating. That's the type of, but we don't actually, I suppose we don't partner with the forum, if you like. The forum's mandate is to work with governments. It doesn't work necessarily with civil society. It doesn't necessarily work outside of the government structures. It does a little bit, but primarily it's focused on government. We primarily work with civil society, but also at different stages with government.
I think we have time for one more quick question, and then we'll have to wrap up.
just wondered, you mentioned about the climate change mitigation issues with moving seawater. What else is happening in terms of climate change mitigation? Deforestation, what else can be done to make the lives of these people in those communities much more bearable and we can't see?
Yeah, look, I think there is quite a bit. I mean, seawalls is probably the best example. The thing is, you can't build a wall around atolls necessarily. You can't just, hem in whole islands. I think seawalls are the best example. When it comes to forestry, there are forestry initiatives, in particular around CO2 offset type of work going on in the Solomon Islands, for example. But that doesn't necessarily link into the community itself and the issues that I talked about. I think what was beginning to happen, 'cause I'm not a infrastructure person. I would more think about societal change and the effects of these things on societal change. We are seeing efforts to, I suppose, codify, regularize displacement and relocation. What I mean by that is sort of like setting up processes that governments should follow to relocate populations, because there's going to be a lot of that happening. And we're involved somewhat with that, with organizations that think through what is the best practice for relocating communities. So we always come with this sort of conflict lens, as we call it, conflict sensitivity lens. How will this affect potential violent conflict, protect against violent conflict emerging, and what are the things that need to happen? Don't quite answer your question because I don't know too much about what's happening in infrastructure.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Kieran. I sense that you just scratched the surface of this topic, and I also sense from the variety of questions that a lot of people in this room are really deeply concerned about what goes on in the wider Asia-Pacific region. And indeed, there are a number of great projects that Rotary is involved in that part of the world, which we can talk about separately. So thank you very much indeed for your time and for your talk. And we have here a token gift, which is a pair of socks associated with the upcoming convention you've heard about. And I believe there's also a Rotary coin in there celebrating 100 years of Rotary, probably of value in about 100 years' time. So thank you very much.